Hi, this is Mr. Philippek, and this video is going to be on roots, stems, and leaves. Now, plants need to have tissue that transport material from one part of the plant to the other. And in humans, we just happen to call that arteries and veins. And of course, plants can't have that easy of a naming convention. So we have one that's called xylem and the other one that's called phloem down here. And xylem is basically dead. Alright, so we'll just kind of highlight this. Dead cells. And its main idea is to transport water. Alright, so it transports water up from the roots to the leaves, because obviously we're not watering plants from the top. We usually put it in the soil, or Mother Nature takes the rain, puts it in the ground, and plants suck up the water. On the other hand, we have phloem, and phloem is living. And it's important to understand that xylem is dead and phloem is living. We'll explain the difference here in a little bit. But basically, it transports the sugar that is made in photosynthesis from the leaves to all the parts of the plant. And so basically, phloem flows food in a downward direction, because food is made at the leaves and then needs to be transmitted to the rest of the plant. Okay, moving on, let's talk about roots. And I really don't think that this information is that difficult, provided we kind of put a little common sense to it. Obviously, roots provide the site for where water and nutrients are absorbed. Again, those nutrients and water are all found in the ground, and roots are that system of the plant that's going to allow for that absorption through diffusion and osmosis. Remember, there's going to be a high concentration of water and minerals in the surrounding dirt, and so through diffusion and osmosis, those materials get sucked up into the plant. The roots also anchor the plant to the ground. Wouldn't it be funny if all of a sudden the wind blew and all the trees down Cunningham blow all over the place? I'm sure the people who live on there wouldn't be real excited about that. So thankfully, the roots anchor the plants. Obviously, the roots are going to transport water and food up to the stem. And what do we mean by food? We're not necessarily talking about sugar and things like that, but we're talking about different minerals and nutrients. But sometimes in the winter, especially, trees store most of their food that they've made leading right before they lose all their leaves in their roots. And so sometimes this food is sugar. And then finally, roots, sometimes they store food. Think about our good friend, the carrot. The carrot, when we eat it, is actually the root of the plant. And the part you don't see, usually we buy them or already pre-processed in a bag. They've lopped off this green leafy area where all the photosynthesis happens, but then all the sugars are stored in the roots. Another great example would be onions. Moving on to stems. Stems obviously support the leaves and the flowers, and sometimes they store food. They also transport food and water both up as well as down, from either the up to the leaves or down to the roots. But the idea here is that the stems are there to kind of help support the plant. Believe it or not, sometimes stems are found underground. And we happen to call these organisms rhizomes. And potatoes, irises, basically what happens is these stems grow underground, and then all of a sudden new plants begin to shoot up. A lot of times people will plant a couple of irises around a tree or around a mailbox or something. If you don't take out those irises before the rhizomes kind of shoot out underneath the ground, the next year, instead of having maybe 2 or 3 irises, you end up having 10 or 11, and sometimes it becomes a little bit of a plant management problem. But potatoes, they grow underground. That's why it's awesome. One of the greatest experiments you can do is stick a potato in a cup of water and watch all the roots just start shooting out everywhere. Eventually, if you put that in the ground, you'll get a whole bunch of potato plants. The next thing we're going to talk about here are annual rings. Something you can do, if you have to take out a bush or a tree wherever you live, sometimes you can count the rings. And as you can see here, the phloem the living phloem, what we talked about with regard to transporting food, is located right underneath the bark of a tree. And it's right next to something called the vascular cambium. And what this really meant to do is it provides growth in two directions. It'll grow xylem this way, and it'll grow phloem the opposite way. And what's nice about that here is that if you notice, the food flow is right next to the bark, right? Sometimes we call it the cork. If you ever, a lot of times arborists, and those are just folks that deal with trees, sometimes they have to, unfortunately, euthanize a tree. And how they do that is they just notch out a ring all the way around the tree, just deep enough to get into the heartwood here, the sapwood. And by doing that, we've taken out the phloem, and so the tree can no longer flow food in any direction. Located to the inside of the vascular cambium is where you see the xylem. Okay, and we're going to talk about the xylem here in a second, because the xylem was what's responsible for the annual rings, and it's basically how you can tell how old a tree is. Depending on how far of a distance there are between the rings, you can tell if we had a rainy season, or if they're real close together, a dry season. And what's nice is that when we get a cross section of a tree trunk, it really tells the history of what happened to that tree. A lot of times, you can see in this example, the bark looks pretty well put together, but when we take a cross section of it, you can see a little scar from a forest fire. And so a lot of times, if arborists or ecologists want to get a good history of what happened around the land, whenever they have to fell a tree, they'll take a cross section of the trunk and try to see what kind of history they can have. They can see what kind of weather, like this summer when we had a real dry summer, the annual rings are probably real close, whereas when we have a real rainy season, you can see that there's a lot of growth happening and the rings are spread apart. And then finally, our last discussion is going to be on leaves and leaf anatomy. And obviously the primary function of leaves is to trap energy from the sun for photosynthesis. And remember, this is how the plants make food, not only for themselves but for other organisms like herbivores or us. And obviously leaves must have a large surface area. If you really think about it, there's only so much daylight during the day. And during the winter, if plants are fortunate enough and are adapted to have leaves over the winter, they need to be able to trap as much energy from the sun as possible so we can fire up that light reaction in order to provide a mechanism to provide sugar to the plant. Now, we're going to go through some leaf anatomy here, and we're going to kind of flip-flop between this slide as well as the diagram, so you can always pause this slide at this point if you need to copy down these words. But the epidermis is this outer layer right here, and you notice there's an outer, or an upper, and a lower epidermis. And it's basically like the skin of a leaf. Our skin, the human skin, is actually called the epidermis as well. And there's usually a little waxy coating on the outside of the leaf to help make it waterproof. The next layer down is called the palisade layer, and this is where we start to see photosynthetic cells. So if we go back to the diagram here, the palisade layer is right here. And typically in the palisade layer, in each cell within the palisade layer, there might be 30 to 40 different chloroplasts. Because it's important that right underneath the epidermis is where we're going to capture most of that light energy from the sun. And then down below, right underneath the palisade layer, is called the spongy layer. And if you notice here, there's a lot of air spaces in this region. And it probably makes sense that it's called the spongy layer because it looks like a sponge. And within this spongy layer, you're going to find the vein. Right? And if you think about our veins transport blood and nutrients and things like that. Sorry about that. And the veins of a plant are tube-like structures that transport materials throughout the leaf. And so here you'll see xylem and phloem transporting food and water. The last part we want to talk about is the stomata. And it's basically the opening in the lower epidermis that allows gas exchange. And through this tiny little hole here, you will have the exchange of oxygen, which is produced by photosynthesis, as well as the release of carbon dioxide, which is a product of photosynthesis here. Cell respiration. This is actually how carbon dioxide will go in, oxygen will come out, and then the gas exchange. It's basically how the plant breathes. Now, the plant can ill afford just to be opening its stomata at will because it also loses a lot of water. Whenever plants open their stomata, they can dehydrate very quickly. And unlike you and I, which we can get up and get another drink of water if we're thirsty, plants have to rely on Mother Nature to provide that water. And so they have a series of guard cells. It's actually 2 cells on the outside that controls the opening of the stomata. Much like our lips and our mouths control whether we open or close them, the guard cells control the opening and closing. Typically during a day, the guard cells are inflated, water rushes in and closes them up, and so the guard cells remain closed, and so photosynthesis and all that stuff can happen. But eventually, at night, the plant has to open those guard cells to allow that exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide both in and out, and provides a way for the plant to breathe. And that's the review on roots, stems, and leaves, and thanks for listening.